So now we have been working towards our fireside chat with our Northern Miners Mining Person of the Year. That would be none other than Chris Taylor, who grew Great Bear Resources, and they were acquired by Kinross for $1.8 billion, a great success story in this industry. He is going to sit down with our very own Alicia Hyatt, who is editor-in-chief of the Northern Miner. Alicia was previously editor-in-chief of Canadian Mining Journal, one of Canada's oldest mining publications, even older than the Northern Miner, if you can believe it. Alicia has more than 15 years of experience as a mining journalist, covering projects and mines, exploration, new technology, and environmental and social issues related to mining. Alicia, great to see you. How are you?
Hi, Anthony. I'm really excited about getting to speak to Chris Taylor today.
Yeah, we're all really looking forward to this, and I'm going to get out of the way and let the two of you sit down and close out what's been another wonderful global mining symposium with what I'm sure will be an excellent conversation.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthony. Chris Taylor is a structural and economic geologist and mining entrepreneur. Chris has over 20 years of experience in the mining sector with both producers and exploration companies. He was most recently president and CEO of Great Bear Resources, leading the company through a major gold discovery and into a $1.8 billion acquisition by Kinross Gold in February this year. Currently, Chris is chairman of Kodiak Copper and advisor to K2 Gold, both with the Discovery Group of companies. And as Anthony mentioned, last year he was named as the Northern Miners Person of the Year. Chris, are you on? Can't hear you.
I am, and now I'm on
There
mute.
you are.
Hi, Alicia.
Hi, Chris. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Well, of course. I mean, as Anthony mentioned, this was a great, amazing story that we've all been covering for the last several years. So really happy to be speaking to you today. Congratulations on your incredible success. It's been about 7 months since the deal with Kinross closed. So have you had time to catch your breath?
Well, we recently completed the sale of the royalty that we spun out of Great Bear as well. So that's just a couple of weeks old now, sold to Royal Gold for $200 million. So we have been busy behind the scenes or getting that off. But I have to say with the Great Bear sale and now the Great Bear royalty sale, that is it for Great Bear. So it's been a great ride with Great Bear, but as they say, it's curtains for that story. So nice to talk about it again and nice to talk to you.
Well, wonderful. And so that acquisition of the royalty company brings the total value up to $2 billion. So that's a nice round number.
Yeah, it was, and funny enough, a bit of a goal in the back of our minds based on the sort of value and the system that we were seeing. So a very nice present to deliver to our shareholder partners with those companies.
Wonderful. So the story of Great Bear Resources is the type of story that inspires people in the mining industry and draws investors into the industry as well. It's this very compelling, classic but rare story of a big discovery where you bet it all on this project, you financed it through the early days, through some very tough times because you believed in it, and you came out with this incredible discovery and created a lot of value for your shareholders. But it took a lot of sacrifice to get there. So I want to just go back to the start of the story. You acquired the Dixie project in Red Lake in 2015. What was it that initially got you interested in the project?
Like quite simply, that was Bob Singh. So my partner in Great Bear right from the early days was Bob Singh, another PGO. Now Bob had worked on this project, or he had been working in the Red Lake area and seeing drill core from this project back, this is going on 10 years ago now. And Bob and I were effectively looking along with the Great Bear board for a project that we could ultimately. Now you have that decision that you have to make. If we make a major discovery somewhere, can we ultimately develop a project? Does it have the infrastructure? Does it have the mining support in the community? So this was one of those rare opportunities where we had a suite of over 150 drill holes Bob had identified the prospectivity on the system, and now it was a matter of starting this sort of puzzle solving process of making the discovery on the project, the real discovery after the several operators had been there over the years and done drilling. But we had to basically figure out the riddle and solve it. And that was the process that we went through over our time there since 2015.
So what did you see that the previous operators had missed? Like, did they know that there was a riddle there?
You know, this is one of the things that's interesting. It's one of the most interesting things about being a geologist is you're really, when you have a project that's rich in data, you have the ability to go through and filter through that data and evaluate it with fresh eyes. And what you'll see if there's different generations of operators on a project is they'll often have very different interpretations for the rocks. You know, maybe the rocks don't look like what you expect visually. So maybe you have to do geochemistry to unravel that puzzle, petrographic work, other things. So we had years, decades of work on this property to look at. And basically our interpretation was very different from some of the previous operators. And ultimately there was a mentality in the Red Lake area that all the rocks had to be, all the mineralization had to be in one suite of rocks. But in the end, we had a different suite of rocks in this property, but very similar mineralization. And then mineralization, a very strong gold mineralization, similar to deposits in other areas of Ontario. So effectively, we had enough data when we got involved to make a reevaluation. And then we had to get out of that box. I mean, people get into a camp, then their thinking is all inside of a box, what we should find in this area. And of course, what we found, as people know now at the Dixie Project, or as Kinross calls it, the Great Bear Project, was something that was completely new to that district.
So with something that's completely new, with a storied camp such as Red Lake, you must have faced some skepticism and trouble convincing people, and maybe you even doubted yourselves at the time.
Yeah, I mean, we were, I don't think self-doubt wasn't too much of a part of it, but certainly we did get a lot of skepticism from other parties who, and I'll say the air quotes, know the Red Lake camp. So if you know the Red Lake camp, you're not going to be looking for a major gold system in the area that we were, and you weren't going to be looking for it in the felsic rocks that we were finding all this gold in. So initially, there was a lot of skepticism in the market, and that's really because if you think about mining projects, they're a bit like hockey players or baseball players, or you know, other people that you can build a stats sheet on. So you'll have, you know, how much drilling, who's operated in the past, what the performance of that project has really been. And when people thought about what this project had provided, it had some splashy gold numbers, but it had some misinterpretation. It had some work that hadn't been done quite properly, quite frankly, and that led to a perception of a lack of continuity in the gold zones and a lack of potential for the big suites of rocks in the project. So it was really up against that sort of, you know, skepticism, which is healthy skepticism in our industry. We get this all the time. And that meant that we had to take some very, you know, precise and consistent steps in disclosing how, you know, the results that we came up with and how we disclose that information, and ultimately leaning on a very transparent disclosure process that built up confidence in the market over time.
Tell me a little bit more about that approach, because I believe that was pretty new or unusual.
Yeah, Alicia, it's right. I mean, we ended up publishing every assay interval from our drill holes. Like, we had tables that were on our website that were all the highlighted results as you'd usually get. But as the project developed and we made the LP fault zone discovery, we ended up coming up with this strategy to address, you know, people's concerns about continuity, size, other factors. So we came out with a series of news releases through 2021, and these were really showing every single assay interval. Like, if you had 10 meters of 10 grams per gold, we would show you how every assay interval from that, you know, that reported interval had come back from the lab. And we did that at different scales. We had a zoomed out scale, a tighter scale, and a really tight scale, you know, at the, you know, individual drill hole level. And that actually was very useful. So what we decided was that we would have, you know, because we had that burden of proof that we needed to establish, we had a very consistent, very transparent disclosure process. And that was really beneficial because what the large companies that were evaluating Great Bear were seeing was very consistent with our public disclosures. And, to be honest, that's usually the failing. If people are looking, especially to transact on a property, they have to make sure that there's reconciliation between what the company sees, what the public market sees, and make sure those are basically aligned. If you do that right from the start and you're very consistent with it, you're going to have a better chance, in my view, of having a transactional type event like Great Bear experienced.
Mm-hmm. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about how the LP zone in particular subverts the typical Red Lake model, which is, as you alluded to, a narrow vein, high grade gold that has issues with continuity?
Yeah, I mean, this is effectively a function of the depth, the pressure temperature conditions when these deposits formed, and the host rocks. Like a lot of the host rocks in the Red Lake area are in or beside ultramafic rocks. And ultramafic rocks, although they're spatially correlated with the gold zones in many cases, are rheologically or mechanically, they deform a bit like toothpaste under pressure. So they're weak, incompetent, and deform a lot. And that means that if you're trying to develop a gold vein type system in these areas, you can get a lot of discontinuity, as stress is partitioned through the rocks and the gold bearing fluids drop out the gold. It happens within veins that are easily deformed. So what we found on our project was that the felsic volcaniclastic package that's on the east part of the property, it's basically behaves rheologically differently from the ultramafics. It tends to be a bit more competent, although it is very highly deformed, very highly sheared on the property that we see. The difference was the way the shearing affected the rocks, it tended to homogenize the gold. And that meant that instead of having dissected veins, it probably had something like a very vein-focused, irregular vein system in it initially, but then was subjected to a great deal of shear, and that shearing ended up creating planar, like sheet-like gold deposits, and those were very continuous. We would end up hitting these things for hundreds of meters laterally and at depth, and that was completely new. And that's simply a function of the formation conditions for these gold systems, and the fact that it's not the mafic and ultramafic volcanic package that hosts most of these deposits. It's the felsic volcanics, and they behave differently under mineralization and stress. Sorry, that's a long-winded technical type answer, but that's I think an accurate description of what we saw. Sorry, Alicia.
and is there, I'm sure a lot of our viewers will appreciate the technical answer, but is there any indication that there are more LP faults?
Yeah, effectively, there could be in that sense, because the belt of rocks that we were focused on extends to the east of where we were. But there are some very interesting specific conditions to the Dixie project, and that's really the contrast between the types of rocks that we see there. And there is a regional fold culmination. There's a big D2 fold in that area, which is really a focus for some of that mineralization. So it is possible that those rocks, if they're deformed and have the same sort of transcrustal suture zones that we saw at Dixie or the Great Bear project, that there could be additional mineralization within the felsic package that sort of sits south of town there.
So you sold the project to Kinross before a resource, an initial resource. I believe Kinross is coming out with the first resource at the end of this year. I guess I know you get asked a lot what you think the resource is going to be, or you don't have to answer that question, but you can if you want. But I'm also interested in whether you're disappointed that you're not going to be there for the big reveal, that you're not the owner at this time.
I think it's an interesting question. No, I can't give you a resource number. First of all, I don't know what Kinross has come up with, as they've done another year's worth of work effectively on the back of what we had. But I would say, like, you're going to end up in a situation with the Great Bear project now that is going to be like some of these other big deposits. And this is my personal view as a geologist, but also really like with the experience on the project. I don't think you will know how much gold is in the ground there, even in the course of the rest of my lifetime. You know, I'm 44 years old right now. I'm very optimistic, you know, when this thing gets into production, that it'll have a multi-decadal life, and there'll be exploration going on that property for many, many years. So no matter what Kinross comes up with, it's only going to be a representation of the near surface portion of that mineralized system. Say if you'd taken the Hemlo deposit, for instance, you know, which is like a 20 million ounce kind of producer. You know, if you had taken the Hemlo deposit and you had defined resources on it sort of 3 years after its discovery, you would not have anywhere near the full picture of mineralization in the ground. And that's what I think you're going to see at the Great Bear project, is a system that will just constantly grow and grow as exploration, then mining, and then more concurrent exploration is in place. So I'm not disappointed to not be involved in the initial disclosure, because, you know, with a system that size, it's not practically possible to define all the gold ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, what a legacy for you. That's pretty amazing. If you go back to the beginning of your career, I'm just trying to get a little bit more insight into your motivations and what drives you. What brought you into mineral exploration in the first place and into studying structural geology?
Well, it's an interesting reflection. So to personally reflect, in my case, I love strategy. I love puzzles, these kind of things. Like, quite frankly, you know, there's certain strategy-based video games I can't keep in my house. Otherwise, I would have completely failed as an individual on a professional basis, because things like chess or Risk or other things like this are really interesting to me. And geology, especially exploration geology, is one of these fields where if you can think creatively, think outside the box, I mean, Mother Nature has provided you these enormous puzzles that you can unravel. You always have incomplete information. You're always using your science training and your intuition to try to figure out what may lie out of view in the ground. So that's very interesting. And then specifically with when you get into the weird combination of geology and the mineral exploration business, is really that science element and the puzzle solving, and then these incredibly complex variables of the market. Right? So how are you going to tell a story? How are you going to raise the money that keeps people interested and compelled to keep investing with your company instead of somebody else? And you're mixing together those factors with the puzzle solving aspect of figuring out what's in the ground before you actually know, and then testing it. I mean, there aren't very many careers like this on the planet. So if you have that really scientific curiosity and you love that sort of tactical and puzzle solving element that you get with that mineral exploration career, there really is nothing else like it. And that's what drew me into it. It was just a unique combination that let me work with great people. I mean, some of the people I've worked with have just been absolutely incredible. Like Bob Singh has been an excellent partner, but the people at Romania Exploration, Terry Bursey, you know, Ian Russell, Crystal McCullough, Rick Greenwood, these guys were absolutely, you know, I learned from them every time I spoke to them. And then we sort of went through this multi-year process of unraveling this system together. And concurrently, we're working in the markets to make sure that we always had the project moving forward. Where else can you do that? Where else could somebody have a career that brings all these diverse elements together and lets you create all this value almost out of thin air? And, you know, the privilege that I've had to work with, you know, some of the First Nations communities in the Red Lake area, at Wabascang, at Lac Seul. I mean, these guys have been incredible partners, and I know that they're going to have huge benefits from this project over time. And I've got to learn about, you know, their culture and their history from them as well. And, you know, where can you put all this together? I feel so privileged, you know, basically to have had these kind of experiences. And I know that's the kind of thing, you know, other careers just can't provide.
What an answer. So I have to ask you this, given what you just said, what's next for you?
Boy, I do get asked that one a great deal. Well, I'm pretty discriminating. So there have been a lot of opportunities that have come in. Some of them are very compelling. Some of them are not compelling at all. Anything that I do next would have to involve the same sort of complex relationship between good science and good market opportunity. So there are some projects and some people that I'm considering working with. And, in my case, people are incredibly important because the right people will generate the right opportunities over time. And, that's the kind of thing I've been looking at, actually for the last several months, although there have been some interesting ideas that have floated in quite recently. So I guess people would just have to stay tuned. I'm quite young. I can't just sit around doing nothing or pontificating for the rest of my life. So I am quite looking forward to getting back in gear here. And I imagine 2023 will be a pretty interesting time.
Well, we will definitely stay tuned for that. I think I guess you won't be bringing a chess board or anything like that into your house in the meantime, so you don't get distracted. So given your huge success, you get asked for advice from other companies, other people in the business. What kind of advice do you give other junior companies who want to have the same sort of success that you have?
Well, there's a number of things I've said, and I get calls from junior mining CEOs frequently. And this is the kind of thing that I'm like, you have to stick with your guns. It's very difficult. If you have a story you really believe in, you have to be able to stick with your guns on the one hand, and basically, like in the case of my family, you go through many years where you may actually be paying more into the company than you ever take out of it. So, in my case, there was, I think around the time Great Bear really got traction going in about 2016, I think I had about $300,000 worth of personal debt on my line of credit, and that was related to keeping the company going and other related items. So it's very difficult at times to live through the slumps in the industry. Those are great times to pick up projects. If you think about the Dixie acquisition, now the Great Bear project, it was about a $200,000 total acquisition that ended up with a $2 billion total valuation only 7 years later. So this is the kind of thing that can happen in a bad market. So stick with it in the bad market, look for those opportunities. And then conversely, one of the problems that geologists sometimes have in the industry is that we fall in love with projects. So you have to be sure when you're working on a project that it could be developed ultimately into a mine. And that means that you may have found a great, very interesting scientific puzzle that you've solved, and you've found mineralization. We all know there's a big difference between mineralization and ore bodies. I would just keep that in mind at the whole time. So there's been excellent projects that I've had over the years that ultimately I've had to let go simply because I felt that they weren't the right opportunity in the context of the market. We couldn't make shareholders do well in a reasonable time frame or with a reasonably high rate of success. So I would highly advise that anybody in the junior sector, looks at that as well. So stick with your guns on the one side, but don't fall in love with your project on the other, and make sure that the opportunity aligns with the market and what your shareholders are expecting.
It's a fine balancing act. So you really put a focus on communicating with retail investors and drawing retail investors into the company. That's a smaller pool of investors than it was, 20 years ago for various reasons. So why was it so important for you to focus on them?
The retail investor is often neglected in the sense that, an individual guy is not going to carve you a check for $20 million, right? But collectively, if you're good at communication and outreach, and you're available on your phone, you can make sure that you bring in investors. I hate to say this, but it's almost like a job interview. When you're talking to somebody who's interested in becoming a shareholder of your company, a lot of the time money is hard to find and you'll kind of take it from whoever you can get it from. But if you have the ability, I know it's more painful, but if you can be more discriminating on who becomes a shareholder, you can have a very loyal shareholder base that follows your story with a great deal of interest. And, within the Great Bear context, there was, I'm aware of about, it's about half a dozen people that had like million share positions on the retail side. So these are individuals that made upwards of close to $30 million off their Great Bear investment. And, that was a lot of conversations. These are all guys that I know well now. We're all friends. And they knew the risks getting involved. We would always try to communicate that very clearly. But, we put a lot of time and as the CEO of a company, it's going to drive your spouse bananas because you'll be talking on the phone when you're walking the dog on Saturday morning, Sunday morning. It'll be like Saturday night dinner and you're going to get a phone call and you're going to have those conversations. So it may not be the best work-life balance, especially going into a heavy retail-owned shareholder base, but it's going to reward a lot of families, a lot of individuals. We've had people with their Great Bear winnings establish charities. We've had people put their kids through university. We've had people just have absolutely life-changing outcomes from these, including our First Nations partners. I mean, these are going to be big projects that are going to have very positive impacts on those communities too. And they're not big communities. These are hundreds of people, a couple of thousand people. And this means that the benefits are pretty significant on an individual basis, or they certainly can be. So anyway, it's time consuming. But the retail guys, if you're a market person and think about it from this perspective, retail sets the price in the market a lot of the time. You end up with, institutions are a bit more passive. I mean, if they're going to buy, they're going to buy. If they're going to sell, they're going to sell. But it's the retail guy who's following your story and engaged in it, who will pick up a bit of stock here and there and keep that price set in the market. So don't neglect it. I understand that it's more work and, it can be volatile, but at the same time, those relationships are going to build dividends over time, and there's no way to shortcut that kind of process.
How can junior companies communicate better with retail shareholders? I'm thinking, obviously, every young person that I come across is invested in crypto, but they don't know anything about mining or exploration, right?
Yeah, I would say that this really is a responsibility for our industry that begins in the home. There's kind of two answers to your question. The first is, how do you generally get people interested in mining? And that's usually telling your kids at home. They're not going to hear it in school, of where things come from. Where'd your computer come from? Where'd your iPhone come from? Where'd the car come from? Where do the wires in the house come from? What happens if we don't have that stuff? Do you think that maybe we should produce that here, or should we buy it all overseas? Is that safer for our country in the future? So these are conversations that we have in the Taylor household all the time, which often made some really interesting conversations in the classroom later on for my kids. The other one on the communication side is really, you have to get, again, fully invested in that communication process. So Bob Singh and myself with Great Bear, we did a lot of kind of interactive webinars, and these were quite useful. So Rita Bennett, she was involved as our basically VP communications through that process. And we'd organize these webinars, and people would, they'd kind of laughingly call me Bob Ross, because I would be drawing, on these 3D diagrams, showing what we thought about mineralization and context and size and all this stuff. And that was super useful because you have so much information in the market. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mining and mineral exploration companies. It is physically impossible to keep track of all of them. So if you're trying to glean investor interest, try to make the message clear, try to illustrate it with a lot of pictures, try to show it as an organic growth process. It's a bit like writing a book. I mean, writing is something I've always really enjoyed, and people may or may not know that I was the author of every news release that came out of Great Bear. So this is often companies will hire an IR person to write the news releases, or it's written by strictly technical staff. But I would say myself and Bob Singh, we would collaborate closely on these things. And ultimately, the final narrative was me. I took that responsibility on because I enjoy it. And when you are successful in this space, it's a lot like writing a novel, because you start with, the initial plot, the characters that are involved. Of course, one of those characters is your project, right? And what it's doing. And then over time, you're building up to hopefully a crescendo, which is either the sale of the company, which was the Great Bear case, or it's going to be the first pour when you get the gold or you get into commercial production. So you're building a narrative. It has to show consistency. You have to keep people interested. So those are the two things. If you really want to bring in investors into this space over time, focus on the one hand of making sure that the younger generation understands the importance of mining, the opportunities for the countries that have mining projects, and the professionals and the other support people that work within these industries. And on the other hand, be very good at your communication strategy, make sure it's engaging, and make sure you keep with the plot. When you lose the plot with these stories, with these companies as they grow, you're going to lose your investor base as well.
That's very interesting about trying to build this plot over time, because I would say most juniors have the opposite approach, where it's just about like short-term excitement. This is like a really great hole that we've got, versus you were very deliberate about, not trying to excite people too much before you understood the plot, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. We had to know where the story was going. And part of that is working with good people. It was very tempting with our story. And, even I'm tempted by these things. It's like being Luke Skywalker and getting seduced by the dark side of the Force, right? So you're drilling great looking gold intercepts. It's hard to raise money. It's hard to get people interested. One of the traps that companies fall into is exactly what you just said, Alicia. They'll put out pictures of the drill core. They'll show all the gold in it, and they'll tell you to wait for assays. Well, you can do that again and again, but basically it's like getting an audience that's just looking for an adrenaline hit or a drug hit or something like this. That's not the best way to build the company over time. The best way to do it is basically to build that narrative that I was talking with. And, that I always had Bob Singh sitting there on my right shoulder, basically, as that sort of angel. Don't do it, Chris. Don't put out the pictures of the gold before we get the assays. And he was very consistent with that. And it helps to, like I said, working with good people keeps you on the straight and narrow.
So I am going to just ask or remind the audience that they can ask questions. So please type in your questions if you have them. And I am going to ask you one more question about, I'm curious about the 2% NSR royalty that we talked about at the very beginning, created early on, and then you spun it out into a public company in January 2020. Can you tell me why you did that and what the reaction was at the time?
Well, thanks for asking that. It was a very interesting reaction when we did that. So we had some ideas that came up from, it was John Robbins. I know we had some conversations there. He was even talking about it, just with broader groups. I even remember his son Chase mentioning it. Doug Ramshaw was another one that was very keen on that idea. So these are guys that were keen and, originating these sort of ideas for the company. And I remember I was a bit skeptical, I'll be honest with you, because I was the guy in charge of raising all the money and keeping the plot with the company at the whole time. So when this was floated as a proposal through the board and we all sat down and discussed it, initially I had to really do some soul searching, and ultimately, what I ended up coming to terms with internally, and then we went with this process, was that it was useful for us to do something unusual, because as you're trying to distinguish yourself from all these other companies, nobody with, okay, let me rephrase that for a second. It's an unusual process to add a royalty to a project and spin it out to shareholders, period. You don't see it a lot. You might see it more in the future. But the bottom line was, because of that skepticism that you had mentioned early on, with people that were not taking the project seriously or did not believe we could have found what we found, this was a mechanism for us. And in my mind, this was the important part. This is that sort of strategic or tactical thinking, was I could go into a bank and they would tell me that I was an idiot, or that we had crippled the project, or that it would never sell now. Surely this was just a bluff, because who would ever do this? And that would force their analysts and the other bankers and their community to look through our data with a fine-tooth comb, more or less, and evaluate, were we seeing what we said we were seeing? And the net result of all that, when we announced we were going to spin out the royalty was people began to believe the story, and we began to get more momentum in the market. So, ultimately, we had an early decision to make with the project where we were either going to buy out the complete ownership interest and buy out the NSRs, or have Newmont, in this case, keep 33% interest and maybe keep the NSR. There was an existing 2% NSR with the underlying vendor. We had some soul searching discussions back in 2016 about this, 2015 actually, and we ended up buying both of that. We bought 100% interest, so we got Newmont out of the way before we started drilling, before we knew anything new about the project, and we also cleaned up that royalty. So a 2% royalty, it's about standard. I mean, if any big company, big mining company out there, they'll have a spreadsheet when they evaluate any sort of opportunity, and in the NSR box, they're probably already going to have a 2% NSR sitting on that, because like I mentioned, mining projects are a bit like hockey players, baseball players. They're known quantities. Most of the big ones, or most of the good ones, have been worked on for years. There's not a lot of new things that come around under the sun. So most of those projects, because of different ownership histories over time, have an NSR. So the 2% NSR we put in wasn't really burdensome for the project. The big companies were assuming there was already an NSR on there, and it was really that mechanism to make the market wake up and take us seriously. So, and you know what? It worked. And at the end, it got us our $2 billion valuation, because it was a $200 million, net value to our shareholder base.
I am going to see if we have any questions from the audience here.
We do, Alicia. We have a couple there. One from Adrian, one from Sandeep. I don't know if you're able to see them.
I can't see them for some reason.
Okay, first one from Adrian. Great conversation, by the way, both of you. Chris, really a lot of really great forthright answers here that are really helping out the audience here. Adrian asks, how useful are technologies in exploration? Do they make exploration an easier or cheaper or quicker?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, technologies, Anthony, and sorry, I didn't catch the name of who asked that, but the technology is a broad term. We could say that drills are a form of technology, and that's certainly the most useful form of technology for figuring out the truth in the ground. Other things that we found useful were 3D modeling, like oriented drill core. Oriented drill core, I can't overemphasize the importance of that to how successful we were, because it's a little bit more money to do it up front, takes a little bit longer to do some of the holes, but in the end it saves you re-drilling. Like, you might save re-drilling, as much drilling as you've already done up to that point, just by having core that you can orient physically in 3 dimensions. Which direction these structures are coming in, and that's going to save you and your shareholders a lot of money over time. So that's one of the most important things. Other things that we did, geophysical tools, airborne geophysics, certainly useful for seeing sort of a bulk context, but on the scale of following up on individual discoveries, that came to careful data collection through drilling. Basically, that was the most important factor.
Okay, that ties in with what Theo was talking about, how you ingest your data and how you organize it. Adrian did say new technologies. I apologize. I missed the word new there. So she was looking for information on new, but you've covered it. Sandeep asks, he starts with a statement. He appreciates your out-of-the-box thinking, Chris. Is the intensity of shearing the same in felsic and volcanics, and what effect does it have on grade?
Ultimately you have to get the gold into these systems in the first place in some mechanism. So in our case, I would say that the impact on grade is probably more important in the homogenization of the zone relative to the absolute grade. So the fact that the LP fault zone is very sheared, and these veins have now become sort of homogenized gold-bearing sheets in many instances. That's more important for continuity and mineability, but the gold was already there, when these sort of that high degree of shearing took place, because we can see remnants of earlier veins. So you probably had a Red Lake type system. It was probably kind of scattered grade that would have been harder to follow up on. And that all got kind of bulldozed into these like vertical or subvertical sheets. And so it's more important for continuity than it is for grade itself.
Got it. And then one for me, I was at Precious Metal Summit the other week there, and then a nice panel at the end there with Ralph Aldis and Rob Cohen. And it was interesting. They both referenced you and your presentations as great resources of having the best PowerPoints, or one of the best PowerPoints, in terms of how juniors should articulate the story. So it was really interesting when you're talking to Alicia, how much thought you put into it. I've never heard a CEO talk about using a narrative structure and using the form of the novel to tell their stories. Really interesting. My question to you would be, who were your influences? Did you see was there any CEOs, any certain PowerPoints that fed into you, or where did that come from? How did you get the best at putting together your decks?
I mean, ultimately, Anthony, I do like to talk a bit about subjects I enjoy. So it kind of came out of that. And I do like, writing. I'm not a published writer, but when I was, having sleepless nights as a young geologist working at Imperial Metals, I would write short stories and other things in my spare time. I've always enjoyed that as a hobby. So I didn't have anybody that I could point to who had sort of that narrative style and trying to keep the thread of the plot through the whole way. That was sort of our own creation. And part of that just comes from desperation. As the CEO of a struggling junior, you think, oh my God, how do I keep my family fed? How do I keep this project financed? How do I keep everything moving forward so people see the same potential that we do? So, necessity is the mother of invention. When your feet are to the fire, you're going to be creative. So, anyway, and because Bob had such a good capacity, Bob Singh had such a good capacity for 3D modeling, with different software, Leapfrog in specific, it was easy to convert his geological modeling flair in 3D into sort of a narrative structure and illustrating everything in real time with investors. And that was just how, that was the particular people and how we came together with Great Bear.
Awesome. We have one more from the audience here, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Is there much hope for accelerating the time taken to go from discovery to mine building? I think here through that lens again of maybe of technology, is there advancements being made that can speed up the timeline?
The main bottlenecks right now, Anthony, like they are specifically, there's the market. The market is always both your friend and your foe. You could have the greatest discovery in the world like today, and you have bad or volatile market conditions, and you just can't get it financed, so you can't push it forward. Sometimes, like what I'd like to see is a streamlining in the permitting and consultation process in Canada. That will help speed things along, and really that comes down to consult really early on the project like we did. Make sure that your local communities really understand what's going on, and that way you're not trying to jump over a fence later on. It's sort of more of a smooth process. So I don't think we're going to have a technological solution to having mines go from discovery to build faster, but we certainly can have legislative and other sort of operational smoothing processes. Those are more important for where we see the hangups these days.
All right, very good. Chris, I must say you're part of the long lineage in the mining industry of really strong leaders that share their success and in a really forthright way, trying to pass on the knowledge. You've really done that here today. Alicia, your questions were excellent to help bring that out. And this was a great knowledge transfer. So a huge congratulations to you, Chris. We watch with eager anticipation for what your next endeavor is. As you mentioned, you have the right to be picky now. So let's see which one you pick.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks very much, Alicia. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Me too.
Great job, both. Thank you. Take care.